Work here at Baker Bookhouse, and I'm delighted you're joining us tonight. Those of you on Facebook and those of you with us tonight. Tonight, I'm honored to host Mary Moorman, her book on Indulgences. Mary Moorman holds a Juris Doctor in Law with a focus on religious legal systems from Boston University, Master of Arts in Religion from Yale, and a PhD in Systematic Theology from Southern Methodist University. In my limited experience, I found Catholics don't speak much about indulgences, and many Protestants think the issue was ended with Martin Luther. So when I first read Dr. Moorman's book, I was delighted to see the issue treated with such logical rigor and theological astuteness. For anyone who has questions about indulgences, Dr. Moorman's book is a must read. I want to thank Dr. John Pinheiro and Aquinas College for their partnership with us on this event. So with that out of the way, please help me welcome Dr. Mary Moorman.
Thank you so much, Louis. It's great to be here tonight. My book is entitled Luther, Catholicism, and the Imputation of Merit with regard to indulgences. And in the year when this book was published, both Protestant and Catholic Christians observed the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, a great protest against what had been medieval Catholic Christianity. The Augustinian priest and friar, Martin Luther, contributed to the movement with his rebuttal against the granting of indulgences, or pardons, as they were sometimes known in the Catholic Church, remissions of the penalty that sinners still owed to God's justice after having confessed their transgressions in sacramental confession. The Catholic Church still grants these remissions penalty in exchange for the performance of designated acts of faith. Throughout time, the Church has interpreted these acts of faith quite broadly, and bishops have granted indulgences for obvious good works, such as almsgiving, pilgrimage, and the recitation of certain prayers. Penitents have also gained pardons, especially in the medieval period, for their contributions to the building of bridges, hospitals, and universities. Because these constructions were believed to be works of mercy, and these structures made life safer and brought people together. Ever since the 16th century, theological and historical thinking about indulgences, whether written by Catholics or Protestants or secular historians, has focused on the indulgence controversy as the occasion for Luther's objections to Catholic Christianity. And it has been a heated and sometimes unsafe conversation, which has not brought people together. Let's first take a closer look at what is at issue in this conversation. What is an indulgence? The Catechism states as follows: an indulgence is a remission before God of the temporal punishment which is due for sin, the guilt of which has already been forgiven, which the faithful Christian who is duly disposed gains under certain prescribed conditions through the actions of the Church, because she is the minister of redemption, who dispenses and applies with authority the treasury of satisfaction that is offered by Christ and the saints. End quote. In other words, the Catholic Church reminds her people that even when we sin, though we have been forgiven, our sin has still robbed God of what he is due, which is first, ourselves, secondly, his glory in ourselves, and thirdly, the just quality of our loyalty that we owe to him for our own benefit. And consequently, a debt is owed. Even following the sacrament of reconciliation, our loyalties must be renewed and demonstrated on the one hand, and on the other hand, our new false attachment to creatures who have been unjustly used, the trauma bond that was been formed by our sin, must be deliberately undone in time and space by deliberate actions of restoration. And the Church provides the means for our renewal and demonstration of our faith in her indulgences by describing the ways by which we may appropriate all that Christ has already provided for us for this purpose. These particular means the church has prescribed have unfolded in different ways and in different times. In the patristic era of the early church, penitents stood outside the walls of their community in public confession of their sins for a prescribed period of time, days, months, sometimes years. Indulgences for them came in the form of intercessory letters written to pastors on behalf of these penitents by heroic confessors of the faith, requesting that the period of their expulsion be shortened and mitigated. They echo the words of St. Paul to Onesimus in the book of Philemon. For my sake, receive this one, and charge whatever he owes to my account instead, so that he might be restored for my sake. And this sentiment echoes the same principle in 2 Corinthians, that the abundance of some serve those who lack in the united body of Christ. In the medieval period, the popular sense of this kind of intercession came to be envisioned as a literal treasury, a treasure box, a repository of the self-offering Christ and his saints, which could be accessed and appropriated by sinners who stood in fear of the fires of purgatory and wished to be relieved of their suffering. A codified covenantal structure emerged whereby a penitent offered his fasting, his pilgrimage, and his charitable work in exchange for a particular distribution from the church's treasury, which would compensate for the debt which he personally owed to God and to his brethren in the church. And modern Europe was built on the many endowments which ensued. In the modern period, the church still offers indulgences, and they may now be construed as follows. My book joins a number of recent scholarly studies which revise substantially the old convictions about indulgences. I'm mostly interested in how theological thinking about indulgences should be done today by bridging the gap in our concepts about this theme. We draw in patristic, medieval, and early modern authorities. I bring to bear a broad range of primary and secondary sources on the issue of indulgences, and I offer a series of prevalent images with which to understand their role in today's church. And this has been called a typically Catholic and synthetic approach, a weaving together of a number of traditional images to help us understand this idea. These images are ultimately biblical in their origin. For instance, as medieval preachers remarked, indulgences ought to be understood within the context of St. Paul's doctrine of the mystical body of Christ. Learn the church is his mystical body, wherein one member of that body may serve the needs of others, because all are joined as one. The same preachers also exploited the metaphors of captivity and ransom, which we also find throughout the Bible, to explain that indulgences served as the payment for the soul's liberation from the captivity of punishment. Penitents draw these payments from the treasury of merit which had been obtained for the church through the sufferings and merits of Christ and the martyrs and the whole company of all the saints. In the modern period, we add two other images as emphasis for our theme. First, we consider the nuptial bond of Christ with his church, whereby the two have become one flesh. The two partners constitute one reality. Just as the law regards husband and wife as one, so Christ, who by his death and resurrection merited the salvation of the human race, is present with and in his church, which can thus distribute the superabundant merits that he and the saints have won to those who are in communion with her. This image is possible because of the second theme, the idea of covenant. For apart from the biblical theme, wherein God states, I will be your God and you will be my people, indulgences make no sense at all. Within this covenantal relationship, God extends his generosity to the persons whom he calls his own, and his own may benefit from that generosity. At the same time, we always recall that the relationship between God and his people, while reciprocal, is nonetheless always unequal, for his people can really ultimately do nothing for God, but God can do everything for them. God would rather that his people glorify him deliberately as they benefit from his generosity. But all along, we have nothing that we have not first received, because God gives us everything we need to offer back to him. Each of the images considered here is a portrayal of unity. Common sense itself suggests that apart from unity, little can be accomplished. But the bringing together of God, neighbor, and self, which is involved in the practice of indulgences, promises limitless blessings to those who belong to the one body of Christ. Indeed, at the Last Supper, one of Jesus' most fervent prayers for his disciples was, "Let them be one as you, Father, and I are one." With regard to indulgences, the unity between the living church militant and the church triumphant in heaven serves as the theological foundation. Christian unity is the expression of the charity that never fails, and in the end is the only virtue that lasts, and is instantiated vividly in our world in the practice of indulgences. And this is the crux of our ecumenical challenge, to which this book also responds. If, as Luther argued, there is a distinction to be made between Christ and the church, if they are not truly one, the efficacy and reality of indulgences will be impossible to accept. However, if we accept the church's vision of herself as the bride of Christ, if that unity is maintained, then indulgences no longer serve as an occasion for division, but rather, I hope, as another manifestation of an essential Christian teaching that is embodied in the daily ministry of the church and the work of her members. And this is a theme which can and should build bridges for understanding among Christians in the modern world. To go further, let's begin by taking a closer look at the most important themes entailed here. First, we think about grace by which we are saved, which is always the gift of God. Here, the Catholic tradition bears witness to two irreducible strands of thought with regards to our salvation. The first strand deals with grace that is internal, the ontological reality of sanctifying grace, which transforms us from within, the vehicle of which in the Catholic tradition is the sacraments. The second strand, which we consider, is the external and juridical understanding of God's grace, which comes to us from him, from without ourselves, and clothes us and is given to us while we wait for that eternal transformation within our souls. Our souls receive the impartation of his very self from outside ourselves, and one vehicle of this impartation is indulgences. I suggest that in her indulgences, we find the Catholic Church at her most Lutheran, inasmuch as there, with indulgences, the Church declares, reckons, and imparts the merits of Christ to cover our accounts before God and to compensate for our losses. Luther's mistake, which inserted itself into various aspects of Protestant theology, was that he absolutized the logic of imputation that had been previously incarnated in the very practice of indulgences that he wished to overthrow. In short, Luther isolated this imputative element from the sacramental logic of the medieval church. He diminished one strand in favor of the other. Not only that, but in reducing the sum total of the experience of salvation to the isolated experience of impartation, and in removing from that isolated experience the practice of theology of indulgences, Luther also undermined the nuptial relationship between Christ and his church. It is this nuptial relationship which makes the two strands cohere in one. In Luther's scheme, Christ imparts his merits directly to each individual. Yet in the Catholic scheme, it is Christ within and for his church who does the impartation to the whole body of believers united together. Luther thus individualized the imputative logic of the medieval church, the bride of Christ, and proposed that the church was ultimately separated from her bridegroom. And that's how this book responds to Luther. But more importantly, my book is more than a critique of Luther. Indulgences are about who we are. As Christians, it is about who we are. And as persons, it is about who we are, wherever we might be. Thus, when I begin my case for indulgences and everything that they recall to us about our tradition, it is important to recall first the logic of the covenant in which indulgences are rooted. God's covenant with humanity is itself an indulgence and a condescension, whereby creator and creature may mutually participate in each other's lives. In this regard, the biblical data, and especially the testimony of St. Paul, describes our life with God as a gracious and bilateral transaction, an active dance. This bilateral covenant finds its closest analog in the order of marriage, which is why St. Paul chose to parallel the love of a husband and wife with the mystery of Christ and the church. Under the Roman law of that time, the essential condition for valid marriage had to be performed by the bride herself. She had to manifest her deliberate and public consent. And once that covenant between husband and wife was confirmed, the bride's authority then extended to that of a full partnership with her husband in a mutual and all-important enterprise of providing for their children and governing their household. And it is only within this ancient nuptial framework that we can more fully understand the logic of indulgences. Because Catholics understand that we might consider the church to be distinct from Christ only inasmuch as she is constantly recognized to be his fully endowed spouse, flesh of his flesh and bone of his bone, who knows his mind, who by virtue of her ongoing covenant with him is truly one with him. And the church's bride thus retains the authority to distribute the contents of the marital treasury, as it were, which is indulgences, for the sake of her children, when they make their own covenants with their father. Since both medieval and canon law treated the husband and wife as one in practice, this nuptial framework came to undergird the preaching of indulgences in medieval Europe. Why did the church have authority to administer indulgences? Because she was the spouse of her Lord. But for Luther, on the whole, the church does not enjoy this sort of ontological union with Christ. And thus Luther did not admit the power to remit punishment for sins under the church's jurisdiction. Moving on to another theme. In this book, I also think about the theology of impartation in medieval theories of salvation. Luther loved the themes of impartation, imputation, and reckoning, which already lay deep within the medieval Christian tradition. These are transactional terms, and they are always understood in the relationship that exists in the covenant that God has made with his people. And here the logic of impartation outside of ourselves, extra nos, is alive and well in the church's teaching on indulgences. Here the logic of attaining the extrinsic merit of another was simply a basic intuition of the popular medieval imagination. Luther then, in advocating for an imparted righteousness that was external to the sinner, clothing him like snow falling on a pile of garbage, did not undercut the basic intuitions of the time, but merely separated and isolated one particular basic theological underpinning that was already known to him, both in theory and in the church's practice, in particular the church's practice of indulgences. In various ways, Luther makes the impartation that we see in indulgences to be the sum total of Christian salvation, and isolated it from its proper place within the corporate body of Christ. Finally, when we think about the corporate body of Christ, we think about the important theme of friendship. Perhaps most importantly, my book considers the friendship between Christ and his church. Charity is, as Aquinas famously defined it, friendship with God. And thus, in her nuptial bond with the bridegroom, the church enjoys friendship with Christ, and in Christ, each member is consequently united with each other. And this is ultimately where the notion of indulgences finds its deepest meaning. The church becomes one flesh with her divine spouse, such that it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And with him, each member is united to every other, and serves and provides for every other from his own resources. As we say, look not on our sins, look not on my sins, but on the faith of your church. And this is the fundamental logic of the treasury. The deposit of Christ's merits being distributed in and through the members of his body and offered back to the Father for the very life of that body, individuals and corporate reality together. On the whole, then, this book answers the call for a new look at indulgences, which is still rooted in the depths of the theological tradition. In indulgences, we see, perhaps, that it is on these points the Catholic and Protestant traditions may be most closely united. And it is in indulgences that we recall the integration of the two strands of God's grace, because the church's ministry is something ontological and fundamentally something that is spousal. And it is in this spousal aspect of our ministry that we find the harmonization of the whole, the place where Catholic salvation and the place for the juridical and sacramental are united. In sum, given what indulgences can contribute to the ongoing conversation between modern Christians, I hope that the conversation will continue and that you all will be part of it. Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna open up, thank you for that, that was very good. So we're gonna open up for some questions, and I'm gonna start off with just a couple that I've been thinking about. So how has your book been received? Has there been any pushback or?
There has been some pushback. It's been
There's some reception. Yeah.
it's been warmly received from the outset.
I was so gratified by the support I received. I think we're good.
That's right. It'd be easier if I could.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so the question was about pushback and reception of the book. So from the outset, the book was warmly received and supported by some leading theologians and also popular exponents on this topic, which was so gratifying and so helpful. I couldn't have gone forward without their support. As far as pushback goes, there has been some very edifying and interesting pushback, both from Protestants and Catholics in the ongoing conversation. And it's so great because it adds so much to my own understanding of this topic and adds so much to my own work on this book as it continues. So from a Catholic perspective, the pushback I've received has to do with the idea of imputation. A lot of Catholics, especially in Catholic scholarship, are not quite sure they're comfortable with that term. But then they have pushback coming within scholarly circles too, because there is a growing community of Catholic scholars who want to affirm the idea of imputation being alive and well in the Catholic tradition, particularly when we look at nominalist theologians, when we look at the work of Augustine, and you can find views of imputation in Aquinas as well, particularly in some of the biblical questions. So that's kind of an exciting conversation that's still unfolding, and my book was initially provoked in some part by that conversation and wanting to say there is a place for imputation in Catholic theology, which I think is an exciting bridge builder between Catholics and Protestants today. The reception from Protestant readers generally is that I'm too strong on Martin Luther, and I will honestly say maybe created a bit of a caricature for him for purposes of this conversation in this way. I love Luther and respect him in so many ways and respect so much of what he said. But Luther himself was such a bombast, with all due respect. He said so much that it's easy to select the pieces that I need for making a caricature of him for this conversation. You never know, maybe you might want to say one thing on one day and another thing next. So on this particular day, I have chosen Luther, who is totally wedded to the idea of extrinsic righteousness, and I've engaged him. Luther also said some amazing things about the corporate body of Christ. He said some amazing things about the sacraments, particularly in his early years. He even affirms indulgences as a theology of prayer, as a theology of the church's intercession. So Luther is just a very rich resource, and I have sinned boldly maybe by creating a caricature of him for purposes of this book. But that's kind of the track I've recognized.
So what's the number one question you get? This must come up a lot when you're talking about your books. What's the number one question you get about indulgences?
How do we make them seem less embarrassing? So the book in part responds to some essays that were written by post-Vatican II theologians who said modern people have a repression about this theme and this practice within the Catholic Church. And like it or not, this practice continues in the Catholic Church. And I have this theory that some of our fondest beliefs and practices as Catholics, the more incongruous they might look to the Western world, maybe the more fruitful they are for us to consider more deeply and kind of trace them back to the foundational beliefs that undergird them. And maybe we get a more powerful and authentic look at our beliefs if we just really dig in with those things that might seem a little daunting or embarrassing. And indulgences is certainly one of them. So early on, the Catholic Church responded to the accusations that abuses were involved in their promulgation. The Council of Trent, we see the Church enacting reforms of her own indulgences, particularly with regards to apparent simony and the need to improve popular preaching and them. Obviously, we're still improving popular preaching about them. There's not much preaching about them going on at all. So I think that what is needed is a general reformation of our understanding of this practice. And it's so interesting, it's such a basic part of human intuition about our relationships. When we have done wrong, we know that there is more to do than just saying, I'm sorry. There are wrongs to be righted, and the relationship has to be healed, and it can be healed by our deliberate acts, which prove our loyalty. And that's what indulgences are. So I think even in modern discussions of our relationships, maybe we even have more references for understanding this practice between ourselves and God when we want to restore that bond.
Any questions? Okay. So you're in an elevator. I gave this one a little earlier, so you had time to think about it. You're in an elevator, and this subject comes up. And we talked about the embarrassment issue. What do you say in that short span of time? You have 30 floors, so I'm giving you. What can you say to help them just kind of initially get past that embarrassment?
So if I were in the elevator and I were speaking with someone, I would say, if you say a prayer right now, you say the Our Father, if you make the sign of the cross, if you pray for a safe elevator ride to the top, and you do so, saying to God at the same time, you are doing this while you're sorry for your sins, and that you hope this makes things better and restores you to Him in some new way. That's an indulgence, and that's what you've done. And there's nothing embarrassing about it. There's nothing acquisitive about it. It's very natural, and it makes total sense in the whole structure of our faith. So I think I would encourage Christians and Catholics to look into indulgences, look how simple they are, and realize they just add an element of intentionality intentionality to the acts of devotion and prayer that we should be doing anyway. And I think that would be my speech. And then I would wish my partner an elevator every day and see what happens.
That's good, I like that. So I want to pick up on something you said. You said these are, indulgences are attached to acts of devotion that we should already be doing anyway, praying, reading our Bible, those sorts of things. But the indulgences only attain if it's done with the intention of getting the indulgence. Is that correct? So I can decide the cross, but I haven't got an indulgence unless I'm intentionally doing it in order to obtain an indulgence. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I think that goes back to the whole notion of covenant that undergirds this teaching in the first place. We have to be so deliberate and intentional about our response to God. And indulgences are an opportunity to do that. So that element of intentionality is saying, I am saying this prayer, I'm serving this person, I am making this pilgrimage, doing this act of devotion in order to atone in some way for the many ways I have wronged my God. Just really enhances and reminds us of the fact that God has offered all of himself to us. And it constantly remains for us to say yes back to him. I think the more public and deliberate that is, the more it glorifies God and edifies the people around us. So I think that intentionality that is involved in indulgences is very needed and very fruitful.
Along those lines, she spoke last night at Aquinas, and somebody raised the issue of pedagogically how to approach this with students, and we talked about the coinciding of going to a graveyard and praying and Halloween. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, that was a great question last night. So a professor brought up that her students were curious about indulgences, and she said, how can I best explain this topic to them? And I said, coming up on the Feast of All Souls, it's a great long-standing historical tradition to go to a graveyard and pray for the people who are awaiting the resurrection there, and to pray for their souls. And it's just a great thing to do. It is indulgence. There's a plenary indulgence attached to visiting a graveyard and praying for the poor souls. So I said, just send your students on a little field trip and remind them of the conditions that are involved in gaining plenary indulgence, which is mass and sacramental confession in 3 weeks, and just have them do it and have them actually experience what is involved and experience God in that way and see what they have to say about it.
So I've read conditions for plenary indulgence, which you just kind of laid out, and it seems virtually impossible to me, especially because you have to have perfect contrition. That's a high bar. Can you explain a little bit more the realisticness of getting that?
So I think, and again, this is a very sort of pastoral question, and I address this topic as a theologian and not a canonist. But I've heard priests say that detachment from sin, that total detachment from sin that is necessary, is presumed and accomplished with every good confession. As long as you aren't, being completely assiduous in your confession. And I think that goes back to the fact that both the priest and our Lord are eager to have mercy and to grant absolution, more eager than we are to receive it even. And so I think the bar is inspiring, but it should not be prohibitive. So
tell us a little bit about partial indulgence and how those are fairly easy to come by. What would you advise to a young Catholic who's trying to be intentional about this? What guidelines could you give him or her doing that?
So for obtaining a partial indulgence, and again, these are the ones that we just can earn throughout our days. Earning is such a funny word. We can acquire throughout our daily lives. Again, making the sign of the cross, saying the Lord's Prayer, doing active service at your own expense to help another person. These are all partially indulgence acts of faith when they're accompanied with the intention of gaining an indulgence. So I would again say to faithful Catholics, just do it. Make a general intention in the morning when you say your prayers that God would honor the indulgence acts that you offer to Him throughout the day. So that's one great way to do it. And you need to be in a state of grace. Confession needs to be regular and routine and frequent, so that sort of line of communication remains open between you and God. And indulgences are a really powerful way of inspiring that open line of communication. If you're thinking about offering and acquiring this grace, if you want to keep that line of communication open, you're going to be doing all of these things. So it kind of works both ways.
I had a thought and went away. Can you gain an indulgence for someone else and also for possibly someone in purgatory? Is that possible?
So we can merit for the souls in purgatory, only because they can't merit for themselves. Is theory. That's why our time in this world and our bodies and time and space is so valuable and precious, because we get to make these deliberate, conscientious acts that unite us to God. Whereas once we're in purgatory, we're just kind of waiting and receiving, hoping. There's nothing really we can do anymore. And so that's why the Church Militant has this really important ministry in showing allegiance to God on behalf of the souls who have already died, who no longer can, and who obviously died without having shown perfect allegiance to God. So that's the way that works, meriting for another. But I also think that in the Church Militant, the Church of the Living throughout the world, that general idea of the repository of merit that the whole church has. I mean, obviously the saints and martyrs who are living exemplary lives of faith right now, they are contributing to that treasury because Christ's grace is alive and well in them as they live in their daily lives. So in that sense, the church always has a super abundance of grace and holiness that is available for others, but in a less precise way. I mean, we can offer and attain a plenary indulgence for a particular person in purgatory.
I can't tell you. This, we've talked about the embarrassment of indulgences, but after last night's talk and today's talk, just our conversation, I myself have gone way beyond embarrassment to actual delighting and pleasuring. I mean, this is such a beautiful gift from God. I mean, this is the whole reason I think your work needs to be out there, needs to be heard and talked about. But you've talked about the reforms that have taken place, especially since Luther and his 95 Theses. He was in favor of indulgence. Is that correct? At the time? What changed? What happened to change?
So in the 95 Theses, 1517, Luther is much more favorable towards indulgences than I think people expect. He's more favorable towards the Pope and the authority of the church in those initial theses. He proposes kind of a mitigation about the Pope's authority that's very offensive to the Pope, and rightly so, perhaps. But he does talk about indulgences. He just wants to kind of figure them out. He doesn't think they need to go away. Later, he refers to them as pious frauds of the faithful. And that's maybe one of the stronger statements about them, but it's also a statement about the way they were being presented. So the theory about Luther is that while other reforms were going on throughout 16th century Europe, Luther's in particular was financed and supported by political actors in this context who wanted to be free from allegiance to Rome. And so he was just sort of a tipping point for other movements that moved away from the jurisdiction of the Catholic Church.
Some of his observations were correct about the uses. Who were some of the people before him that I'm sure that others were before him that were making these similar observations about indulgences? You know, highlight a couple of those.
Sure, that's a great question. So indulgences were just still being figured out. They were an issue for conversation, for scholarly, friendly conversation. Paris and Rome, Reims, larger academic centers of Europe all enjoy talking about them. They were also talking about the sacrament of matrimony. They were figuring out the doctrine of purgatory. all of these things have to be unpacked and still are being unpacked as we figure out the best way to understand and explain our faith. As far as the abuses were concerned, so the problem was in the popular perception of a doctrine that maybe was not very well clarified at the time. And so I think maybe it was just a matter of laziness and misconstruals and miscommunication. I don't know of any reformers at this point who specifically targeted indulgences, but certainly like Catherine Genoa, who was very important on purgatory. I know she said some sort of statements of detraction about indulgences, but no one was quite as vitriolic as Luther came to be about them.
So in some of my conversations with my Protestant friends, and as a matter of fact, I came up today at lunch, they said, well, you can just sell an indulgence. And I said, well, they've never technically been sold. I said, but let's try this as an illustration. Tell me what you think of this. I said, we've all seen ministries that say, you'll send $20 to support this ministry, we'll send you this free Bible or free book or something like that. And I said, so no, technically, you're not buying the book, you're just supporting the ministry and they're providing a free gift. Is that anywhere close to an indulgence analogy?
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy. First, because indulgences are just a way of repairing our bond with God, demonstrating our loyalty. And so when we obtain an indulgence, it rides on the back of something we should be doing anyway. Secondly, we don't buy an indulgence, we obtain one that has been offered to us. And we obtain it by demonstrating our assent to it. So it looks like it is an exchange, but we're just obtaining something that has been offered.
Okay, so I guess any conversation on indulgences would be lacking if we didn't bring up Tetzel. Who was he and why is his name so prominent in this discussion?
So I think Tetzel is the guy with the rhyme, right?
Right.
Help me out.
Yeah.
When a coin in the copper rings, a soul from purgatory springs. So Tetzel was a little bit like Luther. He was just very verbose, obviously. And this was his job. He was promulgating indulgences on behalf of his bishop, and obviously was not very well versed in how to explain them, but so very few people were at the time. So I don't know that Tetzel necessarily deserves the shadow that's been cast over him in his rhyme.
Question? Yeah.
Yes, I was just wondering if you could share some scripture references with us so we can understand how you came to this conclusion. It's because man's tradition can be easily corrupted, so just so we can understand it's from like God's scripture, not me.
Sure, well, I appreciate the question. So the question is asking for biblical text to support this whole idea. I think what's interesting about your question, first of all, though, is the idea that God and man's ideas with regards to the church's teaching would be separated. Because when St. Paul talks about Christ and the church in the book of Ephesians, he says they are one. So he says the two have become one flesh, and I speak of Christ and the church. So that's kind of the biblical pretext that inspired this whole book in the first place. With regards to indulgences and the idea of sharing of merit in the communion of saints, we have like 2 Corinthians 7, which I referred to, which talks about how the benefits of one accrue to the other in the union of the body of Christ. In another place in 2 Corinthians, Paul says that what he suffered on behalf of others. Then we find also through text about how Christ is still glorious in his saints, and how what we offer to him extends his self-offering to the Father in our own bodies in time and space. I'm thinking of a pretext for that one. It's going to come to me. Making up for the suffering, making up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. I think that's Colossians, and that's a tricky one. But I think that talks about, we think about it theologically, like Christ's work continues in his members. If he is one with his church, his work continues in his body, in the world, in time and space. So it's a very, what's the word? I don't want to say militant. It's a very big ecclesiology. It's a very big doctrine of the church that we are invoking here, saying that Christ's body literally in the world is his church. And so I think that's sort of the biblical basis for this whole thing, ultimately. Yes.
Yeah, I really appreciate the talk, and just looking through your book, I actually saw you dealt with when you were dealing with Luther, you dealt with Tomo Mannermann's work with Luther, which I think has put a fresh perspective upon approaching Luther's view of justification. I'm not a Lutheran, I'm a Presbyterian, but in particular, I think Mannermann's work, and I wanted to see what you felt about this. He said the idea of imputation has been growing in popularity among some Roman Catholic scholars, theologians. People are dancing the idea around. And I don't think that has to be separated from some type of deliberative act. Peter Leithart, if you've read any of his work, he speaks about the word deliberative, and that there's a verdict and a deliverance in some sense in justification, being regenerative in a sense, if you follow the words of Roderick from Princeton. I wanted to ask, in light of the idea of union with Christ, so instead of emphasizing everything on imputation, rather understanding that mystical union, and that's the ground of our justification, that's the ground of our reception of Christ, is receiving Christ himself. How would you say that brings the discussion forward in Catholic and Protestant dialogue in light of the justification, joint declaration, basically all of that, because this all rolls up into it. And then I have a second question more about merit after, but I already said enough.
Okay, cool. No, I'll take your first question first. First of all, you sound like a Catholic.
The problem is I don't believe in merit to begin with, so I have a bit of a different.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe this goes to your second question. As I was preparing these talks, I was thinking about merit, especially lately, because I have so little of my own. I mean, I sound like a good Protestant there. It's true. I have so little of my own. And I'm like, what are we talking about? Like in the medieval period, I'm going to go with merit first. In the medieval period, I mean, they really are thinking about this like rationing and proportionality and like how much merit do I have to offer? Like how much recompense do I have to offer in order to get my merit back? It's also measured. I mean, this just does not make any sense anymore. Like, we shouldn't be thinking that way. I don't think. So when we talk about the merits of Christ, I think what we do is just substitute Christ's self. Like he is our merit. And what he wants from us is not our merit, but our very selves. And the quality of our loyalty, which obviously is an ongoing thing that we're growing in. He's not growing, God is not growing in anything. Like we have all of him, but he doesn't have all of us yet. So I think I would like to see merit maybe substituted for what was meant all along, which is just Christ himself comes to us in indulgences, and we give ourselves back to him in indulgences. Not so much our merits, but like we demonstrate our faith and our assent and our desire to be united to him. And I would substitute all of that, say that instead of merit, personally. Going back to your first question, so Mannermann is awesome. Heiko Obermann has joined him, I think, in a lot of commentary on what, more advanced Lutheranism looks like in the modern world, and it starts to sound very Catholic. Like you have this idea of organic ontological unity, and because Luther was at Mannermann, he talks about like breadcrumbs. Like,
I mean, I'm sure Mannermann was pulling from Luther in some way, because like you said, Luther says about a million different things.
Luther says a billion. So good. But anyway, I wanted to say, I think if this is answering your question, I think the conversation is moving towards unity in really exciting ways. And it's moving with regards to like technical terms like imputation, and just the fact that that conversation is happening is kind of amazing. And then you have these Lutherans talking about the church and the union of the ontological body of Christ and how that matters for our salvation. And of course, all of their Catholic interlocutors, if they're good ones, should be jumping up and down and being like, yes, like we are sounding like St. Paul together, and this is good. So, yes.
And I think one other thing I would ask would be, you spoke of the sense in which I guess when you begin, I think you cleared up a lot when you said you'd like to substitute the idea of merit actually, or the word merit rather. Because I guess when you go to basically 1 Corinthians 1:30, it speaks of Christ who is made unto us righteousness, sanctification. I think we're making salvation more personal, we're making it a bit more. I think there is a corporate Christology or a corporate ecclesiology that has to be thought of as well. It's not just existential individualism that the scriptures and that Paul is speaking about. My main question was to say, you spoke about the grace of Christ working through and basically outflowing out of the body. So, Turretin, one of the Reformed scholastics, uses the phrase improper merit. And a lot of people use that phrase to denote our merits, because ultimately, all of our work, all that we do is nothing but an outflowing of what God has already done. So when you speak again of merit and those kinds of ideas, you're attempting not to perhaps put the heaviest emphasis upon this, like in medieval discussions, there was almost this mass of substance that was viewed as merit. You rather want to take the conversation away from some of those medieval scholastic debates and focus upon Christ himself. So again, this is all just an outflowing of life and participation in Christ.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So what was just said was that all of this is about just an outflowing of Christ's life and participation with him. Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Since Robert's on merit, there's been a distinction, and I don't know the term condign merit and the other kind of, can you explain that difference, what that is? I forget the word for the other.
So I think you're thinking of congruous merit, condign, congruous merit, were defined by St. Thomas Aquinas, particularly in the Summa. And I need to refresh my own memory here. Can you do it?
I could have like a few weeks ago, but we just had our first son, so no.
Oh, yes. There you go. So congruous merit is that which habits a response to Christ, and condign is what we receive from him directly, kind of what is used in the sacraments. If anyone would like to correct me on this, they've not cracked open what is grammar powers and far too long. But I think it goes back to this, it's important because it goes back to the idea of this dance that we have with God, this transaction, this interaction of offer and acceptance and demonstration. So condign merit is given to us sort of directly, infused into our souls, and congruous merit happens in this interaction, whereby we demonstrate our acceptance of God.
Any other questions? Well, we've gone about an hour, so Mary, just thank you so much for coming out. She came all the way from San Antonio, Texas, and our weather was much cooler here, so she was so I'm glad you came out. And so on behalf of Baker Bookhouse, thank you so much for coming. Yeah, we will, for books on sale for 20% off, buy the book first before you have your sign it. It should be available for questions right